Prime Minister Nguyễn Phúc and President Donald Trump talk ways to advance Vietnam-U.S. economic ties. Prospect of Vietnam-U.S. trade ties discussed. Hello and welcome to this edition of Bizline brought to you by VTV International. You're with me, Lina Pham. And as usual, we'll begin our program by reviewing the economic highlights over the past week. Vietnamese Prime Minister Nguyễn Phúc and U.S. President Donald Trump discussed measures to develop the two countries' economic ties in a more substantive manner during their talks at the White House, Washington, D.C. on May 31st local time. Prime Minister Nguyễn Phúc and President Trump agreed to join efforts to boost win-win economic partnership. He asked both sides to consider the formation of a value chain from production to consumption to make use of the two economies' complementary feature. President Trump welcomed the settlement of some prioritized trade issues, including the opening of their markets for each other's agricultural and industrial products and information technology products and services. The two leaders were unanimous in effectively carrying out the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement to deal with bilateral economic problems in a constructive and fair spirit and to satisfy each other's legitimate interests. Prior to the talks, Prime Minister Nguyễn Phúc and President Trump hosted a meeting with the press. The two sides issued a joint statement on Vietnam-U.S. relations after the talks. Before leaving for Washington, D.C. to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Nguyễn Phúc spoke at an investment forum in New York on May the 30th, Hanoi time, reiterating that Vietnam exports a variety of goods to the U.S. and brings jobs and economic benefits to the U.S. On the other hand, Vietnam imports a considerable number of technological products and services from the U.S. On this occasion, Vietnam and the U.S. have signed deals worth of $8 billion. We will give you more details about this event in our crosstalk. Also on May the 30th, Vietnam time, Prime Minister Nguyễn Phúc met with NASDAQ Vice President Robert McCooey in New York. At the meeting, Prime Minister Nguyễn Phúc expressed his hope that cooperation between NASDAQ and VNG Joint Stock Company would contribute to better trade between the two countries. McCooey spoke highly of the Vietnamese government's efforts to implement policies to strongly back businesses and improve the investment environment. He told Prime Minister Phúc that NASDAQ has signed a memorandum of understanding with VNG on listing the company's shares on the U.S. stock market. NASDAQ is one of the world's leading stock markets, while VNG is among the biggest internet and technology companies in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, with over 2,000 employees and tens of millions of users around the globe. The United States will create more favorable conditions for Vietnamese fruits to enter the U.S. market, according to U.S. Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue. Perdue made the commitment at the meeting with Prime Minister Nguyễn Phúc on May the 30th. Agriculture Secretary Sonny said that U.S. businesses would like to access Vietnamese fruit market while emphasizing the desire of the country to promote cooperation with Vietnam in the agricultural sector. He also thanked the government of Vietnam for facilitating the export of some U.S. agricultural products to the Vietnamese market and said the U.S. Department of Agriculture would continue to facilitate the export of Vietnamese aquatic products to the U.S. market. Ho Chi Minh City's authorities reviewed its socio-economic development and results in culture, security and defense in May and in the first 5 months of 2017 on Monday. One significant point was increased city budget review over the last 5 months. It exceeded $6.4 billion, 42% higher than predicted and increasing 18.4% year-on-year. This was the result of the economic recovery and land taxes from major projects. During the reviewed period, domestic taxes collection rose 22% compared to the same period last year. Income from crude oil went up 27%, while import-export revenue up 9.24%. We have just reviewed some of the economic highlights over the past week. Up next in our crosstalk, we'll talk about prospect of Vietnam-US trade ties. Vietnamese Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc has just wrapped up an official visit to the United States. Although the U.S. is promoting protectionism with the withdrawal from the TPP and the investigations of 16 countries with the largest trade deficit with the U.S., both Vietnamese and American businesses remain optimistic and are making efforts to boost bilateral economic ties. Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc visit can be seen as one of those efforts which will open up more opportunities for bilateral cooperation in trade and investment. In this week's edition of Bizline, our reporter Khánh Minh has a discussion with Mr. Adam Sitkoff, Executive Director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Hanoi, to find out more about all this. But first, let's take a look at the following clip.
During his visit to the U.S. this week, Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc stressed the need for intensifying trade and investment between Vietnam and the U.S., as this will always benefit both sides. At the Vietnam Investment Forum in New York, joined by 20 leading U.S. financial groups, investment funds, and firms, the Vietnamese leaders stated that the U.S. was Vietnam's third largest trade partner, with bilateral trade turnover exceeding $50 billion last year. U.S. exports to Vietnam are on the rise, and deals signed during the visit could help the two countries achieve a trade balance. The Prime Minister stressed that the trade structure of the two countries was complementary. Vietnam imports machinery, equipment, and other products from the U.S. while exporting fish, shrimp, fruits, and footwear.
Tôi muốn nói các bạn đây, cái phần mà đôi giày Nike này mà sẽ đưa ra đây là phần Việt Nam chỉ chừng này thôi. Đấy. Còn ở đây là bán lẻ của Mỹ được hưởng, cái đây là thuế và các từ đây đến đây 78% này, một găng tay này là người Mỹ được hưởng chứ không phải Việt Nam được hưởng đâu. Tôi nói một ví dụ như vậy. Các nhà đầu tư của Hoa Kỳ là những nhà thông minh, tuyệt vời. Họ thấy được có lợi, họ biết mới mở rộng và họ mang lại cái quyền lợi đó cho nước Mỹ một cách chính thức. Tôi cũng muốn các bạn sẽ đưa cái thông điệp này đến Tổng thống Donald Trump.
In addition to trade and investment, some 30,000 Vietnamese students in the U.S. are also contributing to the country's economy.
Việt Nam là đứng nước số 1 vào số sinh viên ở Đông Nam Á và học ở Hoa Kỳ, và đứng thứ 6 của thế giới này học ở Hoa Kỳ. Và như vậy, Hoa Kỳ nhận được cái nhập khẩu trực tiếp này là rất lớn, vì mỗi năm một sinh viên ít nhất là tốn trên 30.000 đô la Mỹ để học một năm. Mà 30.000 sinh viên trong một năm thì biết bao nhiêu tiền.
Entrepreneurs at the event expressed their trust in the Vietnamese market. The KKR Global Institute said it is preparing a fund of over $9 billion to invest in emerging markets, including Vietnam.
We are particularly bullish on Vietnam as an investment destination because of its favorable macro and demographic trends. As you know well, Vietnam has a large, young, and growing population, some 95 million people with a median age of 30. As you noted, Vietnam has enjoyed strong real GDP growth of over 6%.
The Prime Minister said Vietnam welcomed U.S. investors in infrastructure, energy, education and training, and banking and finance.
Người dân Việt Nam, các doanh nghiệp Việt Nam rất muốn và thích làm ăn với các tập đoàn đầu tư Hoa Kỳ. Vì Hoa Kỳ có sự minh bạch, Hoa Kỳ có sự chống tiêu cực tham nhũng, cùng với cái tinh thần của chính phủ liêm chính kiến tạo của Việt Nam. Cho nên với tôn chỉ chính phủ kiến tạo hành động, một lần nữa tôi khẳng định sẽ tiếp tục xây dựng môi trường đầu tư minh bạch hơn, thân thiện với doanh nghiệp, có độ mở cao và tạo điều kiện thuận lợi nhất cho doanh nghiệp, cho nhà đầu tư, bao gồm doanh nghiệp Hoa Kỳ.
Prime Minister Phúc visit also came along with developments in cooperation businesses from the two countries, including the Memorandum of Understanding signed between VNG Corporation and NASDAQ on listing VNG's shares on the second largest stock market in the U.S. Vietjet Air's contracts with several U.S. companies in purchasing and hiring airplanes, purchasing aircraft engines, and technical maintenance services. FPT Group's agreements with General Electric and UPS in providing IT services. At a meeting in the White House, Prime Minister Phuc and U.S. President Donald Trump both agreed to boost cooperation in trade and investment in the coming time.
Prime Minister Phuc with us from Vietnam, which will hopefully balance out in a short period of time. We expect to be able to do that. They've just made a very large order in the United States, and we appreciate that, for many billions of dollars, which means jobs for the United States and great equipment for Vietnam. And I just want to thank you very much for you and all of your representatives to be with us today. Thank you very much.
Việt Nam cam kết tiếp tục hợp tác để đạt kết quả cụ thể, nhất là về kinh tế, an ninh, và có lợi để làm hợp tác thương mại tự do và công bằng.
Thank you, Mr. Adam Sitko, for joining our Bizline today.
Thank you for having me.
First, could you please give an assessment of Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phoc's official visit to the U.S.?
I think the Prime Minister's visit was very successful. Remember, this is only the third visit that we've had in recent times, and Prime Minister Phuc was the first leader of Southeast Asian countries to get to go visit the White House since Donald Trump has been president. That shows the importance that the U.S. places on the U.S.-Vietnam bilateral relationship, and I think it also shows the importance that Vietnam places on getting to know the new president and members of his team and moving the U.S. relationship forward. I think, as a lot of your viewers of Bizline know, that Donald Trump and some of his top people are very focused on trade deficits. Part of the purpose of this trip and President Trump's discussions with Prime Minister Phuc was how to even that out a little bit. President Trump feels that if the United States continues to buy so much from Vietnam, that Vietnam should also find a way to buy products in the U.S. And I think that that was sort of the centerpiece of the discussions that they had.
Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phoc's official visit to the U.S. saw the signing of some commercial deals worth billions of U.S. dollars, including the agreement signed between Vietjet and CFM International worth $3.6 billion U.S. dollars. So what do you think about this? Will there be more similar agreements on trade deals besides between the two countries?
In the Prime Minister's meeting with President Trump did talk about how the trade deficit was bad and that he was going to hope to balance it out really soon. So I think some of the business deals, like the one that you referenced, are part of that rebalancing of trade.
The U.S. Agricultural Secretary Sonny Perdue, he made a commitment to create favorable conditions for the exports of Vietnamese fruits and aquatic products to the U.S. So what do you think about this sector?
Well, for many years, my organization, AmCham, has been encouraging the United States government to be more fair to Vietnam on some of the rules around importing food. I've lived in Hanoi for 16 years. I like Vietnamese food, and I know that Vietnamese farmers and businessmen can produce good, safe, high-quality food. I think that a lot of people think that, and American people are kind of famous for eating a lot, right? We're big, and there's no reason we shouldn't be eating more Vietnamese food. And so whether we're talking about products like shrimp or catfish or other aqua products or fruits and vegetables, there's a lot of opportunity for Vietnamese farmers and Vietnamese businessmen to expand what they sell to the United States.
Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phoc's visit took place right after a number of major changes in the U.S.'s trade policies. The United States' withdrawal from the TPP was seen as a shock for enterprises from both sides. However, business communities remain optimistic and have begun efforts to build new cooperation mechanisms.
Chúng tôi có ký kết một cái thỏa thuận hợp tác, một cái chương trình hành động cho thời gian tới với cái mục tiêu quan trọng nhất là gắn kết được các doanh nghiệp FDI của Hoa Kỳ với lại khu vực doanh nghiệp vừa và nhỏ của Việt Nam và tạo điều kiện cho các doanh nghiệp vừa và nhỏ Việt Nam có thể kết nối được vào các chuỗi cung ứng của Hoa Kỳ, đặc biệt trong những lĩnh vực công nghệ cao, trong lĩnh vực có cái giá trị.
Vietnam 2016 versus 2015 was the single largest growing economy that was importing from the USA, to which US was exporting. And that is a very, very positive, very strong point from Vietnamese side.
On March 31st, U.S. President Donald Trump signed the executive order that required a report on the causes of the trade imbalance within 90 days to see if trade abusive practices were involved or not. That report is expected to focus on 16 countries with which the United States had a significant trade deficit in goods last year. Vietnam ranks 6th among those countries. The U.S. president also asked for the tightening of anti-dumping and anti-fraud measures.
But you have to look at who's making that money actually in that trade imbalance. And if you look at the companies that are involved there, you'll see a lot of U.S. companies based here in Vietnam making goods and turning around and selling them back to the U.S. and making profit to their corporate office in the U.S. So you have to, it's not so simple these days in modern trade and balance.
There is a big deficit. So of that 52 billion that I mentioned, there's about a 30 billion imbalance in Vietnam's favor. The Trump administration wants to reduce that gap, and we're hoping that they can reduce it by increasing the American exports of goods and services to Vietnam rather than cutting off the U.S. market for Vietnamese exports. That would be terrible.
Vietnam is among the 16 countries that face the investigation for trade imbalance with the United States, as mentioned in the executive orders of President Donald Trump. So, how will this affect the trade relationship between Vietnam and the U.S.?
Well, President Trump thinks in a very transactional way, which means he thinks about deals. What are you getting? What are we getting? And that's how he views trade, and that's how he views economics. So he looks at all the statistics and he sees, well, there's a bunch of countries here that always seem to be selling more to us than we're selling to them. And he labels that bad, or very bad, he might say. And I think he made a lot of news recently bringing up this issue with Germany, German car manufacturers and others, is that he views the fact that when a country has a trade surplus with the United States, that they're somehow cheating America, which costs American jobs. Part of it is true, but it doesn't tell the real picture on trade, and a lot of economists don't agree with President Trump on that. The Trump administration might decide to somehow punish countries that are on that list. We don't know. We certainly hope that that doesn't happen, but I wouldn't be worried that all of a sudden the United States is going to stop buying things from Vietnam.
We do know that there are still existing signs that discourage people from believing in the growing trade ties between the two countries, such as the withdrawing from TPP of the U.S. So what do you think about this?
Well, remember, when for 5 years people were sitting down negotiating TPP, almost everything that was decided, people were deciding on the basis of the United States being in the agreement. So, for example, all the things that Vietnam decided to do or decided to give up or had to negotiate on, it was doing so thinking about what it could, how it could access the American market. Now that the U.S. has pulled out, to me, that changes the whole agreement. I don't think you can just take the TPP text and just erase or cross out everywhere you saw the words United States. It doesn't work like that. There are some things that are going to need to be modified as the countries move forward.
We do know that Japan and New Zealand are among the countries that are pushing for the early signing of TPP, even without the presence of the U.S. So, in your viewpoints, what do you think about the effectiveness of the implementation of TPP, even without the U.S.?
If you're asking, do I still think it would be good for Vietnam to do TPP? I think the answer is yes. When countries trade together and bring down barriers, it makes it easier to do business, it makes the business climate better, and you often receive benefits like lower tariffs and other things. I think you can see the same thing with the RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that has so far been led by China. I think that that's good for Vietnam also. All the other countries, the world is going to keep trading, the world's going to keep making deals, the world's going to keep moving forward, and later this month when we take a group of business people to Washington, D.C. to meet with members of Congress and people in the administration, our #1 point is that the U.S. has to remain engaged in trade, otherwise we fall behind. it's easy for people to say, oh, we're disappointed that there's no more TPP and the U.S. has given up on Vietnam, and that's not true at all. There are plenty of ways to keep moving forward, and that's why AmCham keeps working with its partners in the Vietnamese government to create a business and investment climate that keeps getting better day by day.
How important is trade relations with Vietnam to the United States?
Vietnam, I believe, is the 12th largest trading partner of the U.S., but the U.S. buys more things from Vietnam than Vietnam sells to any other country in the world. So there's no question that for Vietnam, the trade and investment relationship with the United States is very, very, very significant. But I would say for the United States, Vietnam is important. One thing that's always upsetting to me is every time anyone says, well, the U.S. is only the 8th largest investor in Vietnam, or the 9th largest, I don't know what the current number is. When we look at where investment is really coming from in Vietnam, we think America is probably the number 3 investor in Vietnam, because all these big projects like Coke and Pepsi or many others, where the license might say Singapore or the Virgin Islands or some country like that. It's not really. These are American companies making American investments in Vietnam because American companies believe in Vietnam's future. And now we have companies like The Gap, which has very famous stores in the U.S., and Banana Republic and Old Navy and The Gap. And Vietnam is their #1 sourcing country in the world for Nike.
Vietnam exports a number of products to the U.S. and these products are favored by the U.S. consumers. And in the other hand, the U.S. exports a number of products to Vietnam too, so it's the win-win situation.
I think that the Prime Minister of Vietnam was making a similar point, that America wouldn't buy all this stuff from the U.S. if they didn't think it was good. Vietnam currently has the 6th largest trade surplus with the U.S. of any of the major U.S. trading partners. However, the recent trend shows that when we look at all the countries the U.S. trades with, Vietnam had 77% growth over the last 2 years in buying things from the United States. So things going from the U.S. to Vietnam, the value increased 77% during 2015, 2016 in important products like agriculture and others. So actually, Vietnam is one of the most promising export markets that exists for the United States.
This is Boeing's airplane factory in Seattle, U.S., where the Boeing 787 Dreamliner and Boeing 777 aircraft, both of which are used in Vietnam, were made. Boeing has signed a contract to provide 100 Boeing 737s for Vietjet Air. The company is providing technical support for Vietnam to establish a direct flight to the U.S.
Well, I think, what we're really trying to accomplish here is creating a partnership not only with the airline, Vietnam Airlines, and the other airlines within Vietnam, but with the country as well.
Boeing isn't the only American company to see potential in Vietnam. Vietnamese Ministry of Industry and Trade says Vietnam ranks 16th in the list of U.S. biggest economic partners in 2016. Trade growth is at 20% average annually. Even though Vietnam has a trade surplus with the U.S., experts believe American companies are still profiting from this.
Vietnamese are actually producing many of the Nike beautiful shoes, but at the same time, American designers, high-tech molding companies, retailers, and marketers are all part of the mix that make that product.
According to experts, recent changes in the U.S. trade policies may affect trade and investment in the short term, but most businesses from the two countries expect to foster cooperation in the long term.
Potential for it is very, very considerable. Vietnam is in a changing state and growing it very, very rapidly, so it's a very interesting and exciting.
Tôi cũng thấy rằng là cái sự quan tâm của các nhà đầu tư Hoa Kỳ vào Việt Nam thì cũng vẫn rất còn đáng kể, nên là cái việc mà chính quyền của hai nước có thể hiểu được nhau, tìm được cái tiếng nói chung, tìm được quan điểm chung, nhất là trong cái việc hỗ trợ và tạo điều kiện cho các doanh nghiệp hai nước để làm ăn kinh doanh tại hai nước thì sẽ góp phần rất là đáng kể vào cái việc là thu hút thêm đầu tư.
And one of the measures to boost the trade ties between the two countries is through bilateral free trade agreements. So, what do you think that we should do? What steps should be taken to facilitate the signing and the establishment of these bilateral free trade agreements?
Well, I think that both governments have to realize that for a bilateral free trade agreement to move forward, it has to be fair and balanced and seen as fair and balanced by both sides. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to push forward on that. Again, AmCham's partnering with VCCI to try to create an effort to move the countries forward to talk about a bilateral free trade agreement, because we'd like to see it happen. Our companies and our members would like to see a free trade agreement with Vietnam. Both countries have right now the TIFA, a Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, and that's really the formal mechanism where the two countries can sit down and talk about these issues. I think through that they'll decide whether and how to move forward towards an FTA. We think that the U.S. and Vietnam should sit down and look at the path forward towards a free trade agreement just between these two countries. That's something that won't happen overnight. It won't happen quickly. It takes a long time because there are a lot of issues, and the U.S. has a lot of lawyers, and trade agreements are politically very complicated in the United States. But if you don't start talking about it, you're never going to get over the finish line. And so we think that both countries should get together and move forward.
Regarding the recent activity of VNG Corporation that they appeared on the stock market of NASDAQ in the US, so what needs to be done for more Vietnamese enterprises to be listed on stock markets in the US?
The American financial markets are the most sophisticated in the world and have probably the strongest rules. And I think it shows that if VNG can list on an American stock exchange, I think it's a big vote of confidence in them as a company. And so if more Vietnamese companies want to take advantage of the ability to raise capital by listing in the United States on those markets, I think the best thing is to make sure that you're playing by the rules, that you have good audits and accounting procedures and transparency. When I saw that news, I thought it was great, and I hope a few years from now that there's a lot of Vietnamese companies listing on U.S. markets.
The President of the United States, Donald Trump, accepted the invitation to attend the APEC 2017 main events set to take place in Da Nang in November this year. So, what do you think is the meaning of this accepting the invitation?
Well, I think when he comes here, normally when someone comes here and is on the ground in Vietnam, they see it changes what they think about Vietnam in a positive way. They see all the activity and how hard Vietnamese people work and how modern Vietnam has moved in a seemingly short amount of time. And so I think that when the president comes here, he's going to be impressed with what Vietnam is doing. He's going to be seeing Da Nang, which is the part of the country that's probably changed the most in the shortest amount of time, and has turned itself into a modern city going towards a smart city. And so we're hoping that the president here has a great visit and he likes Vietnam and decides to do what he can to help Vietnam and to move forward. That's what we're hopeful of.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Adam, for joining Bizline.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
For many U.S. businesses, Vietnam is now the U.S. biggest trade partner and one of the most attractive investment destinations in Southeast Asia. During his visit to the U.S., Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc stressed that Vietnam exports lots of products into the U.S. and also helps generate many jobs and economic benefits for the U.S. The trade structure of the two countries was complementary. Vietnam imports machinery, equipment, and other products from the U.S., while exporting fish, shrimp, fruits, and footwear. These are the reasons to believe in the strong development of Vietnam-U.S. economic ties in the coming time. That's also the end of this edition of Bizline. Thank you very much for watching. You can rewatch our program at vtv4.vn or youtube.com/vtv4go. From our team here in Hanoi, until next time.